Hello, welcome. It's Dr. Drredfrizzlevideos here again. Today I'm going to talk to you a bit about food chains. So, what I've done is I've listed out my topics. I'm using a brighter pen this time so it shows up a bit for you. Right, photosynthesis. First of all, what does a plant need? Well, it needs CO2, which is carbon dioxide, and it needs water, or H2O, and it converts that using light, so I write light here for you, into oxygen and glucose. Okay, so where does photosynthesis take place? Well, it takes place in the leaf. So I'll draw you a leaf cell and I'll show you precisely where it takes place. So this cell is a leaf cell. It's got loads of circles around the outside. It's got a bit in the middle called the vacuole. It's got obviously a nucleus again. It has basically everything that an animal cell has, plus chloroplasts, a cell wall around the outside, which gives it that nice square structure, which adds extra support. So yeah, and these little circles around the outside are called chloroplasts. Chloroplast. Okay, so photosynthesis takes place in these little ring-like structures around the outside called chloroplasts. The structure of a leaf actually has quite a few cells in. So it's got this, which is basically in the middle. At the top it's got an upper layer, so all you need to know is that it's called the upper layer, which is here. So I'll label that upper. You have a bit in the middle, which is this here, lots of these different cells stacked up. And this is called the palisade leaf cells. You then got the lower layer, so bottom layer. And then got a spongy layer that's made up of irregular shaped cells, which sort of enables gas exchange, which we talked about a little bit with the lungs. But the reason why this bit's adapted especially for the gas exchange is because it's got all these air spaces in between the cells, and these air spaces are maintained by the fact that these cells are all funny shapes. They're not all exactly the same shape, which means that there's larger gaps between them, which enables more space for air. So this I'll label the spongy layer for you. Spongy layer. Right? Here we've got rates. Now I want to compare the rate of photosynthesis and respiration. By the way, respiration, in case you haven't noticed already, is the reverse reaction of photosynthesis. So basically glucose and oxygen is converted into water and carbon dioxide in respiration, which is the complete opposite to photosynthesis. Which is quite convenient really, because plants photosynthesize and the products that they give out, us as humans and other animals take in, like via our lungs and via our food, and what this does is enables us to carry out respiration inside our body. So I want to talk to you a bit about reaction rates. When it's bright light, photosynthesis, the rate of that is much faster than respiration. When it comes to dim light, the rates are almost basically the same. The rate of respiration happens very similar to the rate of photosynthesis. When it's dark, photosynthesis can't take place because you know how I wrote light, which means that there's not enough light for photosynthesis to take place. So that's all you really need to know about rates. I want to talk to you a bit about biomass as well. There's biomass pyramids, and these things called biomass pyramids are basically, you know, we did food chains. They're similar, but they're not quite the same. They're sort of in a different structure, a different way of drawing a food chain, for example. So you can have at the bottom lots of plants, or these are plants, but they're also producers. Then you have your primary consumer, and so on. And then up here you have your predator. Now, the reason why they're called biomass pyramids is because biomass is sort of almost like a measure of how much energy something has. So, for example, your producer, supposing these are just plants and your primary consumers are rabbit, predators are fox, just to give you some example, you're going to have a lot more producers or a lot more individual plants than you're going to have predators for the majority of the time. So rabbits might be eating lettuces, these producers might be all lots of different lettuces. So basically the reason why this is a big chunk at the bottom is because there's a large number of them. Primary consumer, there's slightly less, but there's still a fair few. And then a lot of your primary consumers are used to feed the fox. So you're probably wondering, well, if there's one fox and there's lots of rabbits, where does all that extra energy go? Because surely a load of rabbits have loads more energy than one fox. And yes, they do, is the answer to that. But the energy is like we learned about the life processes, one of which is excretion. So some of the energy is removed from the waste products from our digestive process. And there's other ways that we can have excess products that are used, other ways that energy is lost, sorry. So for example, movement, when we move around, that's basically using up energy, so the energy's got to go somewhere. So some of it's released as heat into the atmosphere, some of it's released as sound almost, because like when we move we make noise, and when we communicate with each other, like now I'm talking, every time I try and talk, that's wasting my energy, or using my energy. So the principle of biomass is basically energy is lost as you go up the chain higher. So it's quite similar to food chains. I want to discuss a little bit with you about food webs. Now you're probably thinking webs, well, spiders have webs, and it is quite a similar sort of structure in terms of drawing it. So you can have like, let's start with a lettuce again. So this is your producer, the bottom of your food web, lettuce. So then you could have an arrow to a rabbit, which eats the lettuce. But then it doesn't just have to be a rabbit that eats the lettuce. You could also have an arrow to a slug, for example. But then you have an arrow from the rabbit to the slug, because the rabbit eats the slug, and the slug eats the lettuce. So you basically have an arrow to whatever eats the particular thing. So that's wrong, because a rabbit doesn't eat a slug. Rabbits don't eat slugs, they eat lettuce. So we need to find something that eats slugs. So you could have a hedgehog, which eats slugs, and then you could have a fox, which eats the hedgehog. But then the fox doesn't have to just eat the hedgehog. The fox could eat something else as well. So the fox could eat a squirrel, for example. Squirrel. And the squirrel could eat something called a nut that's at the bottom of the food web. So basically a food web is basically cross-linking the different food chains, so you don't just have to have one thing that eats another thing. That one thing can have a varied diet. For example, humans are called omnivores because they don't just eat like animals or plants, they eat a mixture of the two. So again, you don't have to just eat the same thing all the time, and the same goes for animals. So a fox might one day eat a squirrel, find one, catch one day it might eat the next day it might eat a rabbit, the next day it might eat a hedgehog. So I've just realised something, these arrows go the wrong way, so you have to point to what eats it. So a squirrel's eaten by a fox, the fox isn't eaten by the squirrel, and the hedgehog is also eaten by the fox. Slug, again, is eaten by the hedgehog. The nut is eaten by the squirrel. Okay, so that's how you do it. You always point to what is eaten by it. So for example, a nut, you're going to point to a squirrel because the squirrel eats the nut. Fox eats the squirrel, so the arrow goes from the squirrel to the fox. Okay, so you need to make sure those arrows get the right way around. I mix them up quite a lot because I always think it's pointing to what's eaten, but it's actually pointing to what eats the particular thing that you're looking at. Okay, so I mentioned the word omnivore there when I was talking about people. I haven't used that term before. Omnivore is something which eats animals and vegetables, so it can eat meat and vegetables. Examples are humans and stuff. They can also have things like bears. They eat a mixture of berries and fish and stuff like that. And you have vegetarians, which are animals that just eat vegetables, and you can have, they're not actually called vegetarians in animals. In people, what we call people who just eat vegetables, vegetarian, who don't eat meat. Now that's not strictly true, because vegetarians, there's different types. There's one type of vegetarian that's called a pescatarian, actually, that eats fish as well. You don't know too much about that, but there's certain animals that are vegetarian essentially, but we actually call them herbivores. So I'll write down herbivore up here so you know how to spell it. Herbivore. You also have carnivores, which are animals that just eat meat. And then you have omnivores. So omnivore. Okay? So I'll discuss to you a little bit about food webs and stuff. What I'd like to talk to you a little bit about is Mercury and DDT. DDT, you don't need to know what it stands for. All you need to know is it's a chemical in an insecticide. Now, in case you don't know, an insecticide is something that farmers put on their crops to kill particular insects. And DDT, the trouble with it was, it managed to kill the insects, and managed to infect the insects and then kill them. But while they're still alive and moving around, a bird came along and it started eating the insects like birds do. But the trouble with that was that the bird became infected with this DDT substance, and then what happened was when the bird laid its eggs, they were very frail and weak, so they sort of burst. Well, they didn't burst, but they sort of crushed very easily, because they had a particularly soft shell that they wouldn't normally have. And this basically meant that the birds started to die out, so the farmers had to stop using this particular DDT substance to kill insects, and you had to stick to more organic methods. Organic basically means without the use of chemicals, and this is a chemical. Okay, so mercury, there's a similar sort of thing, in terms of what mercury does, but the trouble with mercury is it affects the reproductive system and the nervous system of animals. So, for example, you know you have your neurons and nerve cells. I discussed a little bit, I think, with you. Nerve cells are basically that they transmit a particular stimulus, which, again, I'll use the same example as I've used the whole time, which supposing you put your finger on something hot, an impulse is like sent down your nerve cells, which sends a signal to your brain, and then it sends a signal back to a muscle known as the effector, which is then used to pull your arm away from the particular stimulus. So this is essentially, mercury affects that system called the nervous system, but it also affects your reproductive system. So that'll talk to you a bit about sexual reproduction, which is where like people and animals make more of themselves. So it also affects that. So basically, if these chemicals continue to be used, essentially what would happen is one of these animals in the food web would die out, or multiple. It depends what particular animal eats the thing that's infected by these particular chemicals. Infected, I'm not sure I mentioned that before. Infected is where you have a particular thing inside you that causes some sort of negative effect. So infected just means that you've got something inside you. So like when we talked about diseases and stuff like viral infections, bacterial infections, and fungal infections, they're actually all well, whenever you've got any particular one of those, you're known as infected. So food webs up here and effects I've wrote. Now effects is basically, supposing like the hedgehog died, what would happen to the population of the other animals? Well, because the fox eats the hedgehog, if the hedgehog died, the fox would have less food to eat, so the fox's numbers would reduce. But supposing the fox numbers decreased and the squirrel, you wanted to describe the effects that happen to the squirrel population, squirrels would increase because there's less to eat them, because the fox wouldn't be eating them. So I'll just draw another arrow up here, so it could also be eaten by an owl. So supposing the owl died out, then that'd be good for the fox, because the fox would get more food, because the owl wouldn't be eating its food. And the same happens with like any stage of the food chain, food web. You can look at this. So for example, you can look at a nut, you can look at a hedgehog, you can look at any part of it to like describe the effects on other parts. So supposing there was no nuts, the squirrels would die out, which means also the foxes would like reduce in number, because they'd have less squirrels to eat, because the squirrels wouldn't have enough food from the nuts. Supposing you had, let's just do examples of all of them. So supposing you didn't have a slug, there'd be less food to feed the hedgehogs. The hedgehogs have to look for alternative food, so they'd find it harder, so more of them would die out, which affects the foxes, because the fox eats the hedgehog. And again, the same thing would happen with the lettuce. Supposing there was no lettuce, the rabbits and the slugs would die out, which means that the hedgehog wouldn't be able to eat the slugs died out, which then would in turn spiral up the food chain up towards the fox, which would mean the fox wouldn't have enough hedgehogs to eat, and they're all basically linked together, and that's the concept that I'd like you to sort of memorise, if you can. Right, so that's basically all I'd like to talk to you about food webs. I know there's a lot to take in, but hopefully, like with this bright coloured pen, you can actually see what I'm explaining a bit better. And I wish you luck with your studies and hope that this video has been helpful. Please leave a comment or just like my video or even subscribe to my channel, because I do really need some support for my videos. I'm making them out of my own time, and I'm trying my very best to explain it. And please give me any comments or advice that you think would be good for me. So thanks for listening, and hopefully see you in the next video. Goodbye.